Hi. So this is my second video on the topic of culture wars and the relevance to environmental politics. I'm sort of interested in how the structure of class and the kind of interests that go with class position in the rich countries, in rich capitalist countries, affect the kind of political struggles over issues like the climate crisis and so on. And like this research, this is the second video on this. The first one was about theories of social class in sociology, but this one's more about the research that I've conducted with other colleagues in the Hunter region. And so this was like from about 1995. I did a whole set of interview-based studies. And then other colleagues like Stephen Threadgold, Vanessa Bowden, and Jenny Gow worked on similar projects. And so we looked at the general population and did a huge phone survey, a random sample phone survey. It was in about 2003. Looked at youth, which was like later, like 2008 or whatever. Business leaders like 2009, 2011, that period. The findings that I'm going to be talking about today are from our studies in the Hunter region, Newcastle, and a large industrial city in Australia. But they're replicate. I mean, you'll find very similar findings by looking at other ethnographic interview-based studies in other rich countries. So, for example, the two that I particularly like, Ali Hochschild did research on Trump supporting voters in the southern states of the United States, called Strangers in Their Own Land. It's a really wonderful book. And then in Norway, a Canadian-Norwegian researcher called Kari Norgard has done a book called Living in Denial, which talks about how Norwegians both acknowledge and deny the climate change crisis in their conversation and in their social interactions with other people in their communities. And okay, so last time I spoke, I talked about the Ehrenreichs, who talk about how the professional managerial class manage the working class to maintain affluent first world capitalism. That there's a sort of standoff or conflict of culture and interest between the working class and the professional managerial class, which could be shortened as the PMC. And also that there's also a conflict of interest between the PMC and the capitalist class, which requires the PMC to operate to manage the working class and manage affluent first world capitalism, but also resents it and vice versa. And then Bourdieu, who talks about a map of social space based on the ideas of cultural and economic capital, so that you've got the highly educated middle class versus the working class and versus the economically dominant classes, a three-way antagonism, if you like, of culture and interests. And when people talk about the culture wars, I mean, they're talking mostly about clashes on topics like gender and drug reform and things like that. But also, of course, it's the environmentalism comes into that mix. And for me, and also right-wing sociologists talk about the new class, and in Trump's rhetoric, you hear all of this talk about elites, you know, like, okay, so who's this new class? Who are these elites? Well, so in Bourdieu's terms, the people that they're talking about are the people with high cultural capital and, you know, and middle to medium high economic capital, you know, like, so people like university professors have got, you know, quite considerable economic capital, but nothing like the sort of rich, like the Bill Gates, like the 1%. It's not even the same league as those people. But their cultural capital's high. you know, really high. And then you get down to teachers and people, other people in the cultural industries. They've got jobs in the arts, in education, cultural industry, and they're highly educated. There are those with, they are those with higher cultural capital and less economic capital. So when the Trump supporters talking about elites, that's who they're talking about. They're not talking about the rich. No, forget the rich. Don't look, let's just not look at them. Okay. So, and there are other sections of the middle class that are much more close to business life, who don't have the same cultural views at all. You know, like the tertiary educated industrial and commercial employees. You know, like so you know, like time and motion experts or engineers or whatever. And not to mention small business people, you know, like who own a string of shops or something like that. So if we're talking about this cultural elite, you know, let's call them the cultural elite, okay? There are class fractions that oppose this cultural elite. One, the rich. Two, the sections of the same middle class that they're in with higher economic capital and less cultural capital than them, you know, like I just talked about, like people who own a string of shops or something like that. And three, the working class. Now, what I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to restrict my discussion to this topic, which is how do working class people regard this cultural elite in terms of environmental issues, and basically what when they talk about environmentalists, they make the assumption, which is not by no means incorrect, that these environmentalists and the scientists who back up these environmental studies and so on, and who are concerned about environmental issues, come from that cultural elite. So these interviews were conducted in the mid-90s, and they were backed up by a survey in 2003. So that all seems very old, but my experience of politics today suggests this hasn't changed. I mean, a really good index in a sense of how it has, to the extent to which it hasn't changed, is this, which is that the Green Party in Australia is still getting 9 to 12% of the vote. It hasn't really changed since the 90s. And that's because this constellation of class interests and the issues that come up with this is still the same. And when we saw, I mean, the election in which the Labor Party was defeated over the Adani mines in Queensland is another example of how these politics are playing out and still playing out. And that was I think that was the last federal election. So there's the wife of an industrial worker whose name is Margie. I'll talk, well, that's her pseudonym anyway. For the forest, there's a family who are related to men who've been in forestry, called Mandy, Adele, and Martin. Mandy and Adele are sisters, and Martin's the husband of Mandy. There is the steel workers that I interviewed when there was still a steelworks in Newcastle, Ian and Peter. And there's a set of maritime workers who do tugboats and, you know, pilot boats in the Newcastle harbour, called John, Wayne and Chook. Okay, so first of all, Margie. Both she and her husband are from a working class background. Her husband works in secondary industry in a semi-skilled position. She's a stay-at-home mum with 3 kids, you know, something that's possible in affluent Australia in those days. Her interview defended her leisure and consumer behaviour. And so these are all classic things of that board you might talk about, the habitus of the working class, you know, like their cultural norms and values. She's unable to give up smoking despite her religious principles. She and her husband never save money but spend it quickly on holidays. Much of her time at home is devoted to leisure, like reading especially. She likes reading anything except science fiction. She finds her housework boring and relieves the tedium by putting on music. She orders her favourite Motown records from America. You know, this is, yeah. Anyway, and despite a history of diabetes in her family, she is massively into soft drinks and cakes. So you know, she doesn't worry about any of this stuff. So she has what Bourdieu talks about is the habitus of materialism. You know, like the material and temporary pleasures of life are valid in the context of a very hardworking, you know, no frills situation that her husband is in and as a worker, and she is a housewife, if you like. And so all of this fits with Bourdieu's analysis of the working class, the materialism of the working class and their cultural values. So after a critique of the Green movement as extremists, she admitted this was not really based on solid evidence since she avoids the news. I don't watch it and I don't listen to it. I don't go out of my way to keep informed. It's the ostrich syndrome. I don't like to know about wars which have been going on for years over there. Most things I don't think that you've really got much power to change, being one person on your own. So it's no good getting head up about it. And I just think it sort of stems from when I was a child and I first heard about concentration camps. I used to think if you were Jewish in Germany, you would have had to have been really aware of what was going on, been rich enough to get out, and got out. You know, and I thought, well, gee, I don't want to know about it. Who needs ulcers before? So in Bourdieu's terms, this is another classic of working class habitus in the sense that it's what he calls amor fati. In other words, being reconciled to a situation which you can't do anything about. In her case, the sense that she doesn't have much power in society. And so, you know, so why worry yourself about these decisions which are being made by the powerful, which you've got no control over? And there's an emphasis on having a good time rather than an altruism that may not have any impact, you know, like, so it's all very well to get head up, you know, like, and get worked up and try and do things, but there's nothing actually that you in your position in society can actually do. And then she talked about environmental problems, like she at that time she's talking about the hole in the ozone layer, oil leaks, and wild animals. And particularly, there was a lot of pictorial stuff at that time about cormorants covered in oil spill, you know, from an oil spill, like from the Exxon Valdez crisis in America and so on. Other than that, she says, you know, other than the ones that I've just mentioned, she says, other than that, there's always the greenies going on about not cutting down wood and so on and so forth. I don't seem to be worried about it too much. Right, so she's not one of them. She's not one of those people who concerns herself with these issues. I think that they're all into trying to save our natural resources, and they don't want to cut down the trees, and they don't want you to kill off the animal life, which is all well and good, and it's good of them to do that. So at other points, she talks about environmentalists as likely to be more educated, and this is like the two poles that the Ehrenreichs talk about of deference and resentment. Well, this is a deference pole, if you like. These people are understandably concerned about these things, and they're educated and they know about them and so on, et cetera, et cetera. But now she distances herself from them, right? But sometimes I think maybe you've got to learn to stand back. Cutting down the rainforest is awful, yes, but people do need fuel, don't they? And things like that. I mean, you've got to sort of decide when it's right to make a stand and when it's right to let other people get on with their life. So I'll explain what that's about in a minute. But anyway, so when she talks about always the greenies going on, so she sees environmentalists as a coherent political grouping. She gives them a diminutive, dismissive nickname, greenies, right? And then she says that implies that their moralizing is predictable and excessive. You know, they're going on. And then when she says, I think maybe you've got to learn to stand back, she puts them in the role of children. They're not looking at what other people's interests might be. They're just sort of getting onto this moral crusade, which forgets what effect it might have on ordinary other people. You can interfere with other people's real material needs, right? And as an example for all of this, she gives the example of the bushfires in Australia just before the interview. arguing that environmentalists prevented the burning off, which would have saved the bush from the wildfires. This was a very common view being pushed by various kind of right-wing commentators at the time, that environmentalists had made it so hard for ordinary people on farms to burn off their bush that, you know, this had caused all of the wildfires and so on. We got it even in the recent bushfires, but certainly at that period it was massive idea. In other words, greenies, as she calls them, are not practical people. They're moralists who live in the clouds. They don't pay enough attention to the real material needs like farmers and so on. And they're authoritarian in the sense that they're trying to control what other people do in ways that cause various problems. You know, that relates to what I talked about before, the idea that they're elites. You know, in other words, they get the ear of government and then they stop the burning off, you know, which is actually going to save the material interests of ordinary people. So environmentalists are an extremist fragment of the middle class. You know, they don't stand back, you know, they're not impartial, they're emotionally connected. They produce a constant barrage of moralizing verbiage. They're always going on. And this relates to what the Ehrenreichs talk about. The role of the professional managerial class is to supervise the working class, and what they partly do that through is verbal moral exhortation. The cultural elites are you know, masters and mistresses of moral verbiage and vastly going on and explaining things and trying, you know, like, if the cat fit, wear it. So their emotionalism is politically dangerous, and so here we have, she relates them. She almost says, like, they're not that different to the Nazis that, you know, I was worried about when I was a little girl growing up. I'm basically saying on human nature that people, when they get fanatical about something, they lose their sense of judgment. You know, they're involved, they're not standing back. So this response resonates with her response and her ideas about news and politics. You know, like, she avoids the news, she was the ostrich syndrome and so on. All of that's all is about arguments and conflicts, wars going on over there, you know, like not here in Australia, we're all right. It's better to enjoy life in the day to day. Okay, so this is a context in which environmentalism is viewed through the lens of this class difference between the working class and the cultural elites, the professional managerial class, in its cultural elite for the wing of it at any rate. All right, now I'm going to talk about Mandy, Adele, and Martin. Mandy was a tertiary student who, you know, had previously been in various working class jobs. Her husband, Martin, is a tradesman, I think plumbing. Mandy's sister, Adele, was on a supporting parents' benefit. Well, all three of them say that they're concerned about environmental issues and discuss environmental problems, but they indicate very firmly that they would never vote for an environmentalist party like the Greens or whatever. And that's because they're very skeptical about the politics and the positions taken by environmentalists. So Mandy explains Adele's position. So Adele's talking about, you know, why she doesn't like the Greens, and then Mandy explains a position like this. I'm just wondering if that opinion of it, Adele, had anything to do with Dad when he used to work with the logs years ago. We come from a real country family. We all come from the bush. Adele's uncle Mick, he's a man on the country all his life, and he knows the land. He's explained it to us, and he said, what they're chopping down now is nothing to what's going to grow anyway. And he's saying they've just picked a little spot which people are making money on and causing a ruckus over really nothing. I think maybe a lot of our views about chopping the trees down and the unemployment, whatever. So, you know, it comes from their family background, and Adele's uncle Nick, and, you know, Mick, sorry, etc. And I asked Adele if she was concerned that environmentalists would ruin the timber industry. Oh no, I don't think they'll ever do that. And then she laughed and she went, those bushies stand firm. So, right. So, in other words, it's a declaration of war against cultural elites. You know, the man on the land, the working class timber workers, and so on, will stand up to these cultural elites, and they're not to be, you know, pushed away. So it's an Australian kind of folk icon, the man on the country who knows the land. You know, like part of the Australian nationalism and so on. And these people are imposed to impractical city folk, you know, like impractical city folk screaming about the trees being cut down when really it's only a small amount and the more will grow back anyway. And, you know, Uncle Mick knows all about this. Okay, for Mandy, Adele and Martin, this iconic support is mustered in defense of working class jobs. You know, the problem, like the unemployment is the problem. That the environmentalists, through their attacks on the logging industry, are threatening the employment of people who've got a good job working with the logs. So it's the same as Margie. It's the same defense of working class material interests against impractical idealists from the middle class. You know, yeah. So real practical knowledge is what's important. It's not theory and so on and so forth. You know, like I talked about with Jennifer Pont's research on Cessnock in the last video. And here's a more detailed characterization of environmentalists and why they're a problem. And so this comes straight from Adele's mouth. I don't think they know what they're talking about sometimes. I think a lot of them had come from the city and they just go out there and just, you know, they just don't know what they're talking about. I really don't. I mean, I think these, no, I think they go on. Yeah, they do. They go on. Yeah, that's about it. I think half of them are going more for the fun of it. People that haven't got better things to do, I think. They want to get attention. A lot of them are unemployed. They're a bit radical. I think they just carry it too far. So these are middle-class urban people, right, who are going out into the country where real working-class people are trying to make a living with the logs, you know. They have no hands-on practical knowledge. So this is what the Ehrenreichs talk about, the resentment of professionals and, you know, the managerial class and so on within industrial work situations. It resembles that. The time and motion experts, engineers and the like who control work practices. This kind of resentment, which is part of the working class situation and working in you know, like manual jobs and so on, is transferred into this kind of environmentalist context with the cultural elites as the enemy. Their direct action is taken as theatrical and extremist. They're going for the fun of it. They've got nothing better to do. They're unemployed and seek attention. So these people are the spoiled children of middle-class parents who've got the time and money to go around interfering in the serious business of other people's occupations. They don't have a work ethic, you know, like they're just going for the fun of it. They're just wanting to draw attention to themselves and so on and so forth. Their moralism, you know, they go on about the trees and so on, but that's the front, really. What's really going on is a rejection of the real material needs of ordinary people. They're cavalier in their attitude to that. Okay, now I want to talk about the two steel workers, Ian and Peter. Ian, do you worry about Australia's native forests? So that's me talking, not Ian. Ian says, well, what can you do about it, eh? Well, they're going to cut the trees down. They cut them down, won't they? I'm not going to go out there and tie myself on the bloody tree and let them fight and do what they do. I believe in what they try to do, but not much you can do about it. Meaning he agrees with environmentalists that this is an environmental destruction is a problem, but let's be realistic. You know, let's not be this idealist rubbish. You know, let's be realistic and the reality is, as he knows from his experience as a working class man, is that it's really the rich elites, the capitalist class, that makes decisions. You know, jumping up and down as an ordinary citizen, you know, even if you're part of the, in quotes, cultural elite, is not going to make any difference. If they're going to cut the trees down, they're going to do it. So and he talks about an ineffective campaign to stop an ocean sewage outfall polluting a beach. You know, in other words, they put a sewage out on the beach, and all the sewage washes back onto the beach, stuffing up the beach. So what can you do about it? Nothing. So, I mean, they whinged and whined trying to get it stopped to build that up there, but that still got built. Right. So there are three elements in this scenario. There's the powers that be, they, you know, right? He talks about them as they. In Bourdieu's terms, these are the people with high economic capital fraction of the dominant classes. They're the capitalist class, right? In Marx's terms, right? That's they, right? And they basically have the power. It's just ridiculous to pretend otherwise. Then there's another group, those who ineffectually whinge and whine, and I love that phrase. These are environmentalists. They're people with high cultural capital, but they've got no real economic power. So it's all very well whinging and whining. They'll just get nowhere. And then they're the sensible working class people. They avoid such hopeless confrontations. You know, like, excuse me, why would you be wasting your life doing that? So this, again, this goes back to Bourdieu. It defends the working class as the class that looks after their real material needs and is clear-eyed about this, whereas these kind of idealistic, unrealistic moralists and the cultural elites, who wants to be like that? You know, you're wasting your life. For himself, for Ian, that is, leisure and family activities have a much higher priority than attempts to influence governments. He's a keen surfer. He enjoys fishing, and he likes to help the children with their sport, you know, drives them to the sporting field on Saturday mornings, that kind of thing. So this is a critique of the environmentalist middle class for their lack of materialism. You know, like, instead of, they're not even looking after their own material interests and having fun. Instead, they're out on these vain and ridiculous campaigns that are just embarrassing and humiliating because they never win. Okay, now Peter had a very similar perspective to Ian, his friend. Not that surprising. He said, environmentalists are strong on an issue and will get into an argument, but he will stand back. So see how similar this is to Margie, and it relates to Bourdieu's concept of amor fati. You know, this is my place in the world, and there's no point in pretending things can be otherwise. And then he's most concerned that environmental politics can end up by harming ordinary people. And so, for example, industrial pollution is usually caused by industries that have the total support of their local community and provide employment in those communities. And of course, he's thinking partly of the steelworks and the coal mining in the Hunter region. And outsiders have no right to intervene. You know, like, you know, if you're not part of this community and you're not benefiting from these material, interests, then just stuff off, you know. and he had a classic discussion of this was to do with commercial fishing. So what had been proposed in Lake Macquarie, which is this huge, beautiful lake just south of Newcastle, surrounded by suburbs, was that commercial fishing be banned, because what had happened is the fish stocks were dropping, and ordinary, suburban anglers going out in their outboard, in their, what's called in Australia a tinny, an aluminium outboard motor, fishing with their kiddies, like couldn't catch any fish. So like I proposed this to Peter because it was clearly a good example, and he enjoyed doing this himself, of where I'd be interested to see if he'd line up with the environmentalists, and he didn't. He said, well, there again, Terry, I don't really get involved in that sort of thing. I mean, if they're fishing for a living, those guys, aren't they? See? Why should I stop them? I mean, they don't come up to me and say, well, listen, you've been there 20 years. How about giving my son a job there in the steelworks where you're working? Something like that. It's probably higher up that's got to do something about it. So yeah, there you get it again. All right. So what environmentalists are is there's this unrealistic fraction of the middle class. What they're recommending is a ban on commercial fishing. What the impact of that is going to be on people's jobs, who he lines up with, even though actually on the environmental issue in question, he has an opposing interest. Nevertheless, they're part of the working class and they need jobs. That's why he's lining up. This is exactly what happened in the election when the Labor Party lost because of the Adani mines. The whole of the Queensland working class lined up with 3,000 mining workers, or 300 mining workers, however you look at it. That was bizarre, but this is where it comes from. And then the last bit, it's higher up that's got to do something about it. Yes. Again, what you get is this kind of thing, amor fati stuff. It's the ruling class really runs society, and don't pretend otherwise. If something's going to be done about the environment, they will have to do it. So what we hear here is the priority of jobs relative to the leisure pursuits in fishing. And he uses the same argument to attack people, environmentalists who want to stop people from clearing whole areas of bushland to put up rural suburban subdivisions. He says, well, people want a house to live in, no. And here again, what we find is the environmentalists are characterized as moralists who create various kinds of regulations which control people's lives unnecessarily. So he talks about the legislation on burning off. Now, in Australia, an old practice used to be if you had rubbish around the house, you just sort of set a fire in the backyard and burn it off, right? Now you're not allowed to do that because there's a danger that the sparks will fly off and light up a bushfire somewhere, right? He's not happy. Lots of people are not happy about this. A neighbour, an old woman, was snooping around his place and called the fire brigade because he was burning off some papers. All right. And then what happened then? There must have been a dozen blokes there, and he's come into my place and he says, okay, so what's going on there? Okay, so one, there's in this case, the greenies, the environmental, the cultural elite, get the ear of government. They create regulations which control your personal space, right? When you're at work, of course, you're being ordered around, but when you're at home, you've got your own personal space. That's the way capitalism works in the rich countries, in the affluent rich countries with an affluent working class, right? You get your leisure time, you get your home is your castle, and so on and so forth. But environmentalists are undermining those freedoms. Oh, dear. Environmentalists are seen as bureaucrats and moralizing busybodies who interfere with private consumer pleasures. All right, now I want to just say, okay, so there's a kind of paradox of working class habitus. Like habitus is Bourdieu's term for cultural dispositions, way people behave without even thinking about it. That's culturally part of their class location and position. I hope that's okay for Bourdieu scholars, but anyway, there's in terms of that, one of the views of this working class interviewees is that there's a malicious collusion between the political and economic elites, and when Peter and Ian are talking about that, they say the government scratches your back, you scratch their back. They look after themselves. They don't care a stuff about the poor old workers. So that what they're talking about, their back and your back, they're talking about the economic elites. So the government, the political elites are in hand and glove with the economic elites, and they're running the country against the interests of the workers. So this is very anti-capitalist and anti-economic elites. It's like not the elites that Trump's talking about. The real economic elites of society is massively antithetical and antagonistic. So what they believe is that the material interests of the working class should have priority, and therefore they support the economy. In that sense, that they sound like they're pro-capitalist, and they hate the middle class environmentalists because they're not sufficiently concerned with these issues. But they also acknowledge that the real power lies with the rich elite, and they're quite open to the possibility that that is causing environmental damage. So Peter and Ian talking about the politicians, they've got nothing to do but talk about rubbish. I'm absolutely disgusted with the government because they're actually doing nothing for Australia. Ian, they've got too much fringe benefits. Peter, it doesn't matter who's in power, they're all really the same. They're not strong enough. I mean, as soon as they come into power, well, they go overseas and that's about it. I mean, what are they doing for us? So politicians are feathering their nests. It doesn't matter whether the Labor Party, you know, the Social Democrat Party, or the Liberal Party, the party of big business and commerce and so on, are in power. It makes no difference, right? That both of them are working hand in glove with the rich elites. So this working class habitus ends up by being pro-capitalist in the sense of being anti-environmentalist and favouring the economy over all other interests, you know, like over environmental values and so on. But it's not. The important thing to remember is that at the same time it's quite anti-capitalist in sentiment. And I want to finish this video today by looking at some maritime workers who are kind of slightly more articulate in a leftist position than some of the other people that I interviewed from the working class, just to give you a flavour of where this can go, if you like. Okay, and this is about but it's interesting how it sort of fits with what we've already heard. So John, I try to do the right thing at home, a bit of recycling, chasing the kids around, turning off the lights, all those sorts of things, and trying to explain to them. But you may as well go and hit your head against a wall as far as to the total global situation. Because look what they're doing in the rainforest and the Amazon. Wayne adds to this, he says, just to feed a bit of meat to the Yanks, McDonald's. Chook. That's what I mean. It's got to be at the top level. They've got to take a stand and say, you know, how are you going to get a company like McDonald's to say, oh, okay, well, we'll forgo our profits for our shareholders. It just doesn't happen. It can't happen, you know, under the present system. And I said, well, what about the politicians? Why not them? And Chook, it goes on. Who really puts the politicians in? And it's not the voters. It's the people behind the scenes. Yeah, the money that really determines how you're going to go on an election. Wayne finishes up. Yeah, well, big business control government, let's face it. So again, what's similar to the other interviews is the sense that, you know, to use Paul Willis's term, a penetration, like an insight into the way society works, which is that the ruling class actually have more power, you know, the 1% have more power than anyone else in society. And if they're not doing anything about the environment, and then who will? You know, like that's their analysis of things. And so there's no point, you know, they like the other interviewees, not these ones so much, but the other interviewees go, well, conclusion, there's no point in wasting your time, you know, like being involved. Okay, so yeah. All right, so I think I'll finish this one now. Yeah, I'll just sort of round up like this. Okay, so there's this paradox of working class habitus. The paradox is this, that on the one hand, environmentalists are hated for destroying the economy because that means destroying jobs, right? And the other, and what you also have to realize about that is that working class people will line up with other working class people, no matter how small that number is, to identify with them as a class, as against the middle class elites that for a whole lot of reasons that they don't like. You know, the cultural elites, they don't like them, you know, like they'll line up with other working class people who might lose a job rather than with environmentalists who they regard as impractical idealists from the middle class who are, you know, have all the privileges in the world and kind of waste their time in silly moralism, right? So there's all that going on the one hand, and then at the same time, what there is a critique of the capitalist class. The capitalist class are ruthless. they dominate politics, you know, like they control political life by pulling strings, you know, like no, they're not to be trusted. And of course, no wonder things like the environment are getting stuffed up, because, you know, they're in control and they're only interested in their profits. Okay, finished with that now. And next week, or next time I do a video, I'll be talking about middle class, sections of the middle class that are not part of that, the cultural elite, the environmentalist, you know, wing of the middle class, if you like, who are more associated more closely with business and what they think about environmentalists, one. And two, I'll be talking about leaders of business themselves and what they think about environmentalists. And this will confirm the kind of map of class and attitudes to environmental politics that I'm developing here.